The neighborhood was quiet that morning. Birds chirped in the trees lining the streets, and the sun spilled golden light across manicured lawns. For years, the residents had lived side by side, following the rules and keeping the peace. Everything had felt predictable, safe, and friendly. But that peace would not last long. It started with a letter, neatly typed, delivered right to the mailbox. It was signed by someone many already whispered about, an HOA board member who had a reputation for being strict, even aggressive. The letter accused the family of violations that seemed strange and unexpected. It mentioned things that had never been an issue before, and the tone was sharp. It said their actions were disrupting the harmony of the community and hinted at possible fines. The language felt almost personal, like the board member had singled them out for reasons no one could explain. The main resident read it twice, trying to make sense of what it meant. They'd always tried to follow every rule, from mowing the lawn on time to keeping the house looking clean. Nothing had ever drawn attention like this. At first, the family tried to brush it off. Maybe it was a misunderstanding. Maybe someone had misread the rules. But soon, the warnings kept coming, each more insistent than the last. Phone calls at odd hours, emails that sounded sharp and angry. Even neighbors reporting that the board member had been walking around, inspecting properties and making pointed comments. The tension began to build. Even simple tasks like taking out the trash or parking in the driveway felt heavy and stressful. The sense of safety and calm that had defined their lives started to crack. Neighbors started noticing the change too. Some whispered in small groups, unsure what to make of the aggressive stance. Others were curious, asking questions that had no clear answer. The main family did not want to make a scene, but it became clear that this was bigger than them. The HOA board member was targeting them in a way that was visible, intimidating, and public. And the family began to see that they were not alone. Quiet support and nods from other residents gave them a sense that maybe this could be handled, but only if they were careful. The letters kept arriving, each one more alarming. One mentioned that they had received complaints without naming anyone. Another demanded immediate compliance, with threats of escalating fines if the issues were not addressed. Reading them made the main resident's stomach tighten. It was not just the potential cost. It was the feeling of being trapped, cornered by someone who seemed determined to assert power without justification. The whole situation felt surreal. How could someone be so confident in their authority when no clear reason existed for it? Even within the family, the tension was felt. Conversations at the dinner table revolved around strategy and options. Should they respond? Should they ignore it? Each idea seemed to come with risk. There was a constant worry about making the wrong move and giving the board member a reason to escalate further. Stress crept into other parts of life too, affecting sleep, work, and the casual joy of being home. A simple morning coffee felt heavy, accompanied by thoughts of what the next letter might bring. The main resident began keeping notes. Every letter, every phone call, every email was logged. Dates, times, words, used, everything. It became a small ritual, almost a shield against the uncertainty. This record-keeping was more than practical. It was a way to maintain control in a situation that felt otherwise uncontrollable. Slowly, a pattern began to emerge. The accusations often referenced rules selectively, sometimes quoting bylaws that did not actually apply. The tone was threatening but inconsistent. It was clear that the HOA board member was trying to assert power more than enforce. Real regulations. Other residents began to notice too. Some came forward quietly, sharing stories of similar encounters. A pattern appeared. The board member seemed to take pleasure in creating tension, singling out households for scrutiny while ignoring others who might have similar or even more significant issues. It was unsettling. The community, once a place of casual friendliness, was now tinged with caution and suspicion. People who had exchanged greetings freely were now wary of how their words or actions might be interpreted. The main resident decided to step outside and take a walk, hoping for clarity. The streets looked the same, but the feeling had shifted. Where neighbors once waved without a second thought, some now offered cautious nods. The beautiful landscaping seemed a little less comforting, the sunlight less warm. But as the resident walked, a thought began to crystallize. Fear alone could not dictate their lives. They had always respected the community rules, and they had nothing to hide. Maybe understanding the problem fully was the first step to solving it. Back at home, the family started gathering materials. Copies of the HOA rules, records of past communications, photographs of the property showing compliance. Everything was organized in neat folders. It was a practical step, but also empowering. Action brought focus, and focus brought a sense of control. As days went by, the letters kept arriving, but the main resident no longer felt paralyzed by anxiety. Each letter was read, noted, and stored. Each call was answered calmly or noted for follow-up. The sense of being under siege was still there, but it was accompanied by a new determination. Friends outside the neighborhood offered advice, ranging from ignoring the board member to seeking legal counsel. It was overwhelming at times. Yet amidst all the opinions and suggestions, one truth remained clear. This was not just about following rules anymore. It was about standing firm, knowing the rights they had as residents, and preparing for a confrontation that seemed inevitable. The family began discussing strategies openly, debating the best approach without letting anger dictate decisions. Patience and clarity became their guiding principles. Meanwhile, the HOA board member continued her campaign. She visited neighbors' homes under the guise of inspections, attended community events with a watchful eye, and made pointed comments in public meetings. Her presence was intimidating, but it also revealed something important. She believed in her own authority, whether or not it was real. Understanding that gave the main resident a sense of what needed to be done. The challenge was not just the letters or the threats, it was the perception of power and how to dismantle it, without causing unnecessary conflict. Late one night, after another letter arrived, the main resident sat at the kitchen table, reviewing every document again. They felt the weight of the situation, but also a growing sense of resolve. The quiet hours of the night brought clarity. The key was preparation, knowledge, and composure. Reacting with panic or anger would play into the board members' hands. Instead, they needed to know the rules better than anyone, understand the limits of authority, and be ready to demonstrate it when the time came. The days passed, and the tension remained, but something shifted subtly. The family began to notice small moments of encouragement. Neighbors who had initially been hesitant offered supportive words, discreetly shared experiences, or simply smiled in understanding. It became clear that the HOA board members' power was mostly intimidation, and that unity and preparation could counter it. The family realized they were not alone, and that gave them courage. One morning, a new letter arrived, this one more urgent and threatening than the last. But this time, instead of panic, the main resident read it with calm determination. Every point in the letter could be challenged, every claim examined, every threat mitigated. The house that had felt trapped and under siege now felt like a place of planning, strategy, and quiet strength. The first step in a long journey had been taken, and the family was ready to move forward. What had started as a peaceful neighborhood morning had become the opening of a battle, not fought with anger or shouting, but with patience, understanding, and careful preparation. The HOA Karen had believed she could intimidate, but the family was beginning to see that knowledge and calm resolve could be far more powerful than threats. The quiet bird songs in the neighborhood seemed almost symbolic, a reminder that life would continue, and the family would not be defeated by someone who had overstepped her boundaries. This was only the beginning, but it was an important beginning. Every letter, every call, every inspection was a test, and with each challenge, the family grew more certain that they could face it, not with fear, but with strategy, patience, and the truth on their side. The neighborhood might look the same, but everything had changed. And the first part of their journey toward reclaiming control had begun. The days after the first letters arrived were tense. Every morning, the family woke with a small knot in their stomachs, wondering what new demand or threat might arrive from the HOA board member. She had a reputation for being relentless, and it seemed she would not stop until she had the upper hand. Each letter was read carefully, logged, and stored, but the emotional weight remained. There was a constant feeling that they were under watch, that someone was scrutinizing every action, waiting for a misstep. The board member's actions grew bolder. She began walking through the neighborhood in a way that seemed almost deliberate, making sure her presence was noticed. On a sunny afternoon, she stopped by the family's driveway, inspecting the property with a clipboard in hand. The main resident watched from inside, heart pounding. She made comments loud enough for the neighbors to hear, remarks about grass height, fence alignment, and other minor details that had never been questioned before. It was clear she wanted to intimidate not only the family but anyone who might consider siding with them. Neighbors began to react differently. Some avoided eye contact, unsure if their association would bring unwanted attention. Others whispered about her, sharing their own experiences, which ranged from minor disagreements to full-blown confrontations. The Main family realized that the HOA board member had been operating this way for years, subtly influencing the neighborhood and creating fear without much accountability. That realization brought a mix of frustration and resolve. They could no longer ignore the situation or hope it would pass. Inside the house, the family met daily to discuss what to do next. Every decision was weighed carefully. Should they confront her directly? Should they consult a lawyer? Should they gather more evidence before responding? The family understood the importance of patience. Any reaction driven by anger could worsen the situation. They began to assign responsibilities. One member focused on collecting all correspondence, another reviewed neighborhood bylaws, and another spoke discreetly with neighbors to understand the larger context. The strategy was simple: know everything before acting, and act with certainty. The HOA board member sent another letter, this one threatening fines if the alleged violations were not corrected immediately. She mentioned deadlines, inspections, and consequences that seemed disproportionate to the minor issues she had noted. The main resident read the letter aloud, and the family discussed each point. Some of the claims were easy to challenge, others required more research. The letter ended with a tone that implied urgency and authority, as if she alone held the power to decide right or wrong. The family knew better. They understood that the power she claimed was not absolute. They began spending evenings reviewing old HOA documents, meeting minutes from previous years, old letters. An archived correspondence revealed that many of her claims were inconsistent with established rules. Some bylaws had been misquoted, and some regulations had not even been enforced consistently. The family realized that her authority was largely performative, relying on fear and uncertainty rather than legal standing. This knowledge gave them a sense of empowerment, but also underscored the importance of careful preparation. They could not confront her recklessly. They needed facts, clarity, and evidence. The family also noticed how her behavior affected the community. Casual conversations became cautious. Laughter in the neighborhood diminished. Some families avoided social events out of fear of drawing attention. The main resident felt a mix of anger and responsibility. They realized that confronting this situation was not just about protecting themselves. It was about restoring fairness and respect for everyone. They began talking to neighbors discreetly, encouraging them to observe and document anything unusual. Slowly, a quiet network of awareness began to form, collective readiness to counter intimidation with knowledge. Despite the stress, the family tried to maintain normalcy. Children went to school, adults went to work, and daily routines continued, but always with a lingering awareness. Trips to the grocery store, walks in the neighborhood, and casual visits to friends now carried a subtle tension. It was as if every action was being weighed, and the sense of freedom they once had had narrowed. But the family refused to let fear dominate. They reminded each other that knowledge and preparation could turn the tide, and that the situation, though serious, was not unbeatable. One afternoon, a neighbor approached the main resident quietly. They had noticed the board member's behavior over time and shared stories of minor fines, inspections, and threats that had been quietly resolved. The neighbor emphasized that documentation and calm confrontation were the most effective tools. The conversation reinforced the family's strategy. They were not alone, and the intimidation could be challenged without aggression. The realization was encouraging, providing both practical advice and moral support. As the days passed, the HOA board member continued her pattern. She called meetings, sent emails, and made unexpected visits to ensure her presence was felt. Each encounter was unnerving, but the family used it as an opportunity to test their preparation. They observed, recorded, and analyzed, treating each interaction as a step toward understanding her limits. It was clear that she relied on fear and uncertainty. When confronted with calm knowledge, her authority wavered. One morning, a particularly aggressive letter arrived, threatening fines that could escalate if compliance was not immediate. The family gathered to review it carefully. Each point was checked against the bylaws and past practices. Some threats were found to have no legal standing. Others were exaggerated. They began drafting responses, not in anger, but in a factual, calm tone. Their plan was to present evidence and calmly assert their rights when the time came. The act of writing, reviewing, and preparing was therapeutic, turning anxiety into action. Even in the midst of tension, small victories emerged. A neighbor discreetly shared an old HOA document confirming that certain fines could not be imposed without prior notice. Another neighbor recalled a precedent where the board member had been challenged successfully. These small pieces of evidence built confidence. The family realized that preparation and documentation were powerful tools, far more effective than confrontation alone. The challenge was to remain patient and methodical, knowing that the right moment to act would come. At home, evenings were filled with quiet discussions. Every letter, phone call, and visit was dissected. Every document was reviewed, every rule examined. The family maintained a calm exterior, but inside, they were alert and focused. They rehearsed conversations in their minds, anticipating questions and challenges. They imagined the possible outcomes, weighing the risks and benefits. The process was meticulous, but it provided a sense of control in a situation that could easily feel chaotic. One night, after a particularly stressful call, the main resident stepped outside and looked at the neighborhood. Lights glimmered in windows, trees swayed gently in the breeze, and everything seemed peaceful on the surface. Yet beneath that calm was a simmering tension, the quiet battle of authority and preparation. The resident took a deep breath, feeling both the weight and the resolve. This was not just about letters or fines. It was about standing firm, knowing one's rights, confronting challenges with clarity rather than fear. The family also began documenting every interaction with the HOA board member more thoroughly. Notes were taken immediately after visits, emails were saved in organized folders, and phone conversations were summarized. This detailed record-keeping was a safeguard, ensuring that when the time came to confront her, there would be a clear, factual trail. The discipline of documentation brought a sense of empowerment, turning anxiety into tangible action. Each note, each saved email, was a step toward reclaiming control. Neighbors who had been hesitant began offering subtle support. A quiet word here, a nod there, even sharing experiences they had kept private for fear of retaliation. The family realized that the board member's power depended largely on isolation. By connecting quietly with others, they could build a support system that made intimidation less effective. It was slow, careful work, but every conversation reinforced the sense that they were not alone, and that collective awareness could counter unjust authority as the second part of this journey unfolded. The family learned more about the board member's patterns, motives, and weaknesses. Her threats relied on fear and ambiguity, and they could be countered with knowledge, patience, and calm evidence. The family's confidence grew alongside their understanding. What had once been overwhelming now felt like a challenge that could be met strategically. They were no longer simply reacting. They were planning, analyzing, and preparing for the moment when they could assert their rights and reveal the limits of her authority. Every day brought new letters, visits, and reminders of the board member's persistence. Yet, the family faced them with growing determination. They knew that preparation was the key, and that calm, factual responses would be far more effective than confrontation driven by emotion. The days of fear and uncertainty were being replaced by focus and resilience. The family had taken the first steps toward reclaiming control of their home, their lives, and their neighborhood. The battle was far from over, but they were no longer passive participants. They were ready to face the challenges ahead, armed with knowledge, preparation, and the quiet strength that comes from standing firm in the face of intimidation. The family felt a growing sense of purpose as they continued to collect every document, email, and record related to the HOA. They realized that to stand up to the board member, they needed not only patience but clarity. The previous weeks had been filled with tension, but now they were ready to dig deeper, to uncover the truth behind the threats and intimidation. It became a mission to understand how authority had been misused and to gather evidence that could not be ignored. They started by reviewing old meeting minutes from HOA gatherings. These records were often dense, filled with formal language and procedural notes, but the family went through them carefully. Slowly, patterns began to emerge. The board member had repeatedly pushed for rules that were either outdated or selectively enforced. Some fines and complaints had been issued without proper documentation. In some cases, neighbors recalled her acting in ways that contradicted the official records. The inconsistencies became clear. Her power was based more on perception than reality. Armed with this insight, the family began reaching out discreetly to longtime residents. They met in living rooms and backyards, sharing stories of past interactions and unusual demands. Some neighbors admitted they had been afraid to speak before, worried about retaliation or social ostracism. Others were surprised to hear that someone else had noticed similar patterns. The conversations were enlightening and emotionally supportive. The family realized that they were not alone, and that others shared their concern about fairness and proper procedure. The family also started consulting publicly city ordinances and HOA regulations. They discovered rules about how fines must be issued, how inspections are conducted, and what authority board members actually hold. Many of the letters they had received violated these procedures, and this knowledge became a source of confidence. The family began compiling a clear, organized file of violations and missteps. Each document strengthened their position, and the act of preparing felt empowering. Turning frustration into action, they took care to remain calm during interactions. The board member often tried to provoke responses, using threatening language or making unannounced visits. The family learned to respond politely but firmly, never allowing fear or anger to take control. Each interaction was noted, analyzed, and added to the growing evidence. The routine of documenting every detail gave them a sense of control and prepared them for the moment when they would confront the authority. As they continued to investigate, they uncovered evidence of past disputes the board member had had with other residents. Some complaints had been dismissed, while others had been resolved quietly after intimidation. The pattern was clear. The board member's influence relied on fear and uncertainty, and she avoided situations where her actions could be challenged openly. This realization was crucial. The family now understood that exposing inconsistencies and presenting evidence could neutralize her threats. The family also began to discuss the broader implications of their findings. They realized that standing up to the board member is not only about their own home but also about protecting the neighborhood from unchecked authority. They wanted to ensure that all residents could feel safe, respected, and treated fairly. This perspective added urgency and meaning to their preparation. The challenge became not just personal, but communal, and it reinforced their commitment to act strategically in parallel. The family continued to handle the daily pressure of the board members' tactics. Letters continued to arrive, phone calls were made at inconvenient times, and random inspections occurred without notice. Each instance was stressful, but the family's preparation allowed them to face it with measured responses. They never reacted impulsively, instead using each encounter as an opportunity to gather information and refine their understanding of the rules. Neighbors began to notice a shift in the family's demeanor. Where once they seemed anxious and unsure, they now appeared calm and organized. Some residents approached to ask questions, seeking guidance on how to handle minor interactions with the board member. The family shared advice cautiously, emphasizing documentation, patience, and understanding of the bylaws. A sense of quiet leadership emerged. As other neighbors began to recognize the value of preparation and knowledge over fear, one day, while reviewing old correspondence, the family discovered a letter that directly contradicted the board member's recent threats. The letter had been sent years earlier, establishing clear precedent for how certain issues should be handled. This was a breakthrough. The family realized that presenting such evidence could effectively challenge the board member's authority. It was proof that her claims were not only unfounded, but also inconsistent with established rules. Excitement and relief filled the room as they realized they were building a strong case. The family also began practicing conversations and scenarios. They anticipated possible questions, threats, or arguments the board member might raise. They rehearsed responses, always keeping a calm tone and focusing on facts rather than emotion. These exercises were both practical and psychological, helping them gain confidence and composure. By preparing thoroughly, they felt ready for a confrontation that might have seemed intimidating just weeks earlier. As preparation continued, the family noticed small changes in the board member's behavior. She seemed more cautious, her visits less frequent, and her letters slightly less threatening. It was subtle, but it suggested that their consistent calmness and documentation were having an effect. The family recognized that authority built on intimidation could be weakened by knowledge, preparation, and quiet confidence. This realization strengthened their resolve to continue, knowing that the eventual confrontation could be won. During this period, the family also focused on emotional resilience. Stressful situations can be exhausting, and they made a conscious effort to support one another. Conversations included reassurance, shared reflections, and reminders of the bigger purpose. This emotional foundation was essential. It's providing strength for the practical work of gathering evidence and planning strategy. They knew that patience, clarity, and composure would be just as important as the documents and records they had collected. Neighbors continued to provide insights. One resident shared details about a past meeting where the board member's claims had been challenged successfully. Another recalled instances of inconsistent enforcement that supported the family's emerging narrative. These stories, combined with official records and correspondence, created a comprehensive understanding of the situation. The family could now see not only the board member's weaknesses, but also the broader context of her behavior. The intimidation was real, but it had limits, and those limits were becoming clearer every day. The family began organizing all their findings into a structured file. Each piece of evidence, from emails and letters to witness accounts and official documents, was categorized. This made it easier to access when needed and ensured nothing was overlooked. The process was meticulous, but it provided a sense of control and readiness. They knew that when the time came to reveal the truth, every claim could be supported by evidence, leaving the board member without the power to intimidate or manipulate. As the investigation progressed, the family also reflected on their own growth. What had started as anxiety and fear had evolved into focus, determination, and strategic thinking. They had learned the importance of patience, careful observation, and documentation. They had discovered the value of community support and the power of knowledge. Most importantly, they had developed confidence in their ability to stand up for themselves in their neighborhood, not through confrontation or aggression, but through preparation and clarity. The family now understood that the battle ahead would not be won by anger or force. It would be won by calm, methodical action, supported by facts and evidence. They were ready to present their case when the right moment came, confident that the truth would override intimidation. The knowledge they had gained about the rules, the board members' patterns, and the support of their neighbors provided a solid foundation for the confrontation. This period of research and preparation also reinforced the family's sense of justice. They were not merely defending themselves. They were challenging an abuse of power and standing up for fairness in their community. The lessons learned extended beyond the immediate conflict, shaping their understanding of responsibility, courage, and the importance of knowledge. They were no longer passive participants in the situation, but active strategists, ready to act when the time was right. By the end of this stage, the family had a clear picture of the board members' limitations. They knew the inconsistencies, understood the bylaws, and had gathered multiple sources of evidence. They had strengthened their emotional resilience, engaged neighbors discreetly, and prepared for every possible scenario. The foundation was solid, and the family could feel the shift from fear to readiness. They were no longer reacting to threats, they were preparing to confront them effectively, with calm, clarity, and undeniable evidence. The third part of their journey had transformed them. What had once been uncertainty and intimidation had become preparation, understanding, and quiet confidence. They were ready to face the board member, not with anger or fear, but with knowledge, patience, and the authority that came from understanding the truth. The family knew that the next steps would be decisive, and they felt prepared to take them with composure and purpose, ready to reveal the reality behind the board member's false claims and overreach. The day of the HOA meeting arrived with a quiet tension that seemed to settle over the entire neighborhood. Inside the house, the family prepared meticulously. They had organized every letter, email, record, and witness account they could find. Each document was carefully labeled and placed in a folder that would be easy to reference. They rehearsed the points they wanted to make, the questions they expected, and the calm, factual responses they would give. There was no room for emotion to cloud their judgment. This had to be about clarity and evidence. When they arrived at the meeting, the room was already filled with residents and board members. The air felt thick, a mixture of curiosity and anticipation. The HOA board member sat at the front, confident and composed, ready to assert her authority. She looked directly at the family with an expression that suggested she believed she had already won. But the family had spent weeks preparing for this moment. They understood that perception could be powerful, but evidence could be stronger. The meeting began with routine announcements, but the tension became palpable when it was time to address the family's situation. The board member spoke first, outlining her complaints, referencing rules, fines, and alleged violations. She spoke loudly, projecting confidence and authority, but as she presented, the family quietly took notes and observed, ready to respond with clarity rather than confrontation. When it was their turn to speak, the main residents stood calmly. They addressed the board member and the assembled residents, speaking slowly and clearly. They began by referencing specific bylaws, historical documents, and city ordinances. Each point was backed by evidence they had carefully collected. The room grew quiet as neighbors listened to facts rather than threats. The family did not raise their voices. They did not show anger. But their composure projected a quiet authority that was impossible to ignore. They methodically went through each accusation, presenting documents that directly contradicted the board member's claims. Letters from previous years showed inconsistent enforcement of rules. Meeting minutes confirmed that certain fines could not be applied without notice. City ordinances clarified the limits of the board member's authority. With each point, the confidence of the board member visibly faltered. Her voice wavered, her posture stiffened, and she struggled to respond to the clear evidence presented. Neighbors began to react. Some exchanged glances, realizing that the threats they had feared for years were based on selective enforcement and intimidation. Some whispered quietly to one another, acknowledging the family's preparation. The mood in the room shifted subtly, from tension and uncertainty to curiosity and support. It became evident that the family's calm, evidence-based approach was making a real impact. The board member attempted to interrupt, to challenge the claims, but the family remained composed. They responded with facts, referencing the documents in their folder, and calmly explained why each claim lacked legal or procedural standing. The more she tried to assert her authority, the more it became clear that her position was based on perception rather than law. The room's atmosphere began to change, and even the other board members started asking questions that the board member could not answer definitively. The family also highlighted examples from other residents, showing that her selective enforcement had created tension and fear across the neighborhood. They presented witness statements, carefully obtained, that reinforced the pattern of intimidation. Each example was factual, precise, and respectful. The approach was methodical and persuasive, and the effect was powerful. The board member could no longer rely solely on bluster and threats. The truth was being laid out clearly for everyone to see. As the family continued, the board member's confidence visibly diminished. Her tone became defensive, her attempts at persuasion less effective. The residents in the room began to realize that the family was not only prepared but also informed and strategic. The dynamic had shifted. The family was no longer the target, they had become the authority in the room. Supported by facts and preparation, the main resident paused occasionally to allow the audience to absorb the information. They maintained eye contact with the board member, projecting calm and control. Every point they made was backed by documents, records, and precedent. The family's preparation and composure created a sense of credibility that could not be denied. It became increasingly clear that the board member had overstepped her bounds, and the audience sensed this as well at one point. Another board member quietly asked a question about the legality of a fine that had been threatened. The main resident responded by citing the city ordinance and a previous meeting minute. The room went silent as the other board members realized that the board member's authority had limits, and that those limits were being exposed with clear evidence. The family's calm confidence had created a turning point. The balance of power in the room was shifting. The family continued presenting evidence and examples, covering each of the board members' claims. They were precise, respectful, and unyielding. Neighbors who had been hesitant began nodding, and some whispered words of encouragement. The cumulative effect of preparation, evidence, and composure was undeniable. The board members' attempts to maintain authority became increasingly strained and less convincing. Finally, the main resident addressed the overarching issue, the importance of fairness, clarity, and respect for the rules that govern the neighborhood. They emphasized that authority must be exercised responsibly and within limits. The audience could feel the truth in their words. The board member, now noticeably unsettled, struggled to respond. Her position had been revealed as dependent on fear and selective enforcement, rather than genuine authority or legal standing. The meeting continued with a careful discussion of each point raised. The board member was unable to refute the evidence, and the other board members began asking clarifying questions. The family answered calmly, clearly, and with patience. Every response was backed by documentation, ensuring that there was no room for doubt. The atmosphere in the room shifted completely. The family had turned what had begun as a threatening situation into a demonstration of knowledge, preparation, and quiet authority. By the end of the meeting, the impact of the family's preparation was undeniable. The board member's credibility had been undermined in front of the audience. The other board members now had a clear understanding of the limits of her power. The family had not shouted, argued, or shown anger. They had simply presented the facts, demonstrating that preparation, composure, and evidence are far more powerful than intimidation. After the meeting, residents approached the family to express support and relief. Some thanked them for standing up not only for themselves, but for the neighborhood as a whole. The board member left with her authority diminished. The family could feel the sense of control returning to the community. The careful preparation, the documentation, the calm confidence had made all the difference. The family returned home, exhausted but triumphant. They reflected on the journey that had led to this moment: the letters, the calls, the inspections, the meticulous research, and the discreet conversations with neighbors. Each step had been important, each preparation essential. The confrontation had been successful not because of confrontation or anger, but because of clarity, knowledge, and composure. The day's events left the family with a deep understanding of power, authority, and the importance of preparation. They realized that intimidation can be powerful only when met with fear. When met with knowledge, composure, and evidence, it loses its force. They had turned a threatening situation into an opportunity to assert truth and fairness, setting a precedent for how the neighborhood could respond to misuse of authority in the future. As the evening settled, the family looked out at the neighborhood with a sense of relief and accomplishment. The struggle had been intense, but the outcome had restored balance and respect. They had faced a formidable challenge with patience, preparation, and integrity. The neighborhood could breathe again, and the family had demonstrated that courage is not always loud. Sometimes it is quiet, steady, and backed by knowledge. Part 4 of their journey ended with a sense of closure for the immediate conflict. The board members' overreach had been revealed. The family had demonstrated authority through preparation, and the community had witnessed the power of evidence and composure. Yet the family knew that the lessons learned would continue to guide them in the future. They had discovered the importance of understanding rules, preparing carefully, and standing firm when confronted with intimidation. This knowledge would serve them well in any future challenges. The days following the HOA meeting were quiet but full of reflection. The family had faced the board member and presented evidence that clearly demonstrated the limits of her authority. Her threats had been exposed, her confidence shaken, and the community had witnessed the truth. Yet the family knew that restoring full balance in the neighborhood would take careful steps, not just a single meeting. They focused on reinforcing clarity and fairness in the community, ensuring that the lessons learned would endure.